Chapter 18. Saxen? Dare whirled to see Sir Jacob standing astride the black horse. She was still trying to get used to the camp. It was far more spread out than what she had envisioned, and she hadn't counted all the tents yet, or the number of elves. She glanced sideways but offered a smile to the knight as she rubbed her arms together. The chill was sharp this morning, and it was piercing her as much as the pain with which she'd awakened. Last night, she and Kelin had slept on blankets that felt like clouds in a simple canvas tent. She hadn't seen Thalon yet, and Kelin had grabbed her leg and held on when she tried to sneak out. She rose onto the balls of her feet as Jacob approached, and did her best not to hunch her shoulders. "Yes, my lord?" "You look pretty bad there, kid." She shrugged. The horse snorted and tossed its mane. The knight shot him a sharp glance. "No," he stated. "You look bad, and we've seen more than our share of bad." He thumped the steed on his shoulder. She shrugged again while her gaze shifted to the black war horse. "Why does your horse run with unicorns? I wouldn't think they'd like horses." He rolled his eyes. "Because he thinks he's a stud." He dodged a hoof that just happened to stamp down right where his foot had been. Dare stretched her neck, scanning the camp. The knight sighed. "That look on your face. I see it all the time on the recruits' faces back at the Citadel. You're lost." She stiffened, and then shook her head. I'm just, exploring the camp. And I had orders from that other knight, Sir Amthras." He chuckled, and she swore the horse sniggered. "Fine. What are you exploring for?" "The surgeon's tent." She glanced around again while thinking, and it gave me an excuse to search for Thalon. "Oh." The knight's face twisted as if he'd eaten too sour a lemon. "Pena." She stiffened. His expression relaxed. "Don't worry. He just doesn't like mortals." "Does anyone here?" "Thanks," he drawled. He put a huge hand on her shoulder and spun her around. "Pena's tent is that one over there, next to the big spruce. See it?" "Yes." "Be careful. If you set off any mental sparks, his head'll catch fire." "He's hot-headed?" she ventured. "No, he just hasn't had an original thought in 1,200 years, so his mind is like dry firewood. I don't think he'd left Long-Range Palace in a few centuries. Hell, only the total desertion of it evicted him, and he's not happy about it." "Thank you." "Yeah, good luck, kid." Her pace wasn't as self-assured anymore. The surgeon's tent was square and larger than the others around the camp. Somehow it wasn't what she expected. The whole camp wasn't what she expected. She didn't know what she had anticipated, but it wasn't this. She wasn't sure if she'd thought they'd have special collapsible buildings or something, but she didn't expect ordinary-looking tents, campfires, and horses. It was too normal. She looked up at the looming canvas hall in front of her. She took a deep breath. "Is anyone here? Master Surgeon? Master, Pena?" The tent flap flew open, and she stared up at a tall, stiff-faced elf. He had frozen green eyes and thin black hair. "Use the word physician, please. It exists in the common language." She blinked. Yes." "Well, come in." He turned away, not even holding the flap up for her to step inside. She pushed through the folds of the cloth. Expecting the interior of the tent to be muggy, she gasped at the chill in the air. She saw netting sewn into the tent walls where the breeze flowed through. She also saw 2 cots beside a low table with knives and other various tools arranged on it. She lifted one of the tiny black blades. "Is this?" She ran her finger across the edge. "Is this glass?" "Put that down!" the physician snapped. Startled, she did so. He straightened his shirt as if patting down ruffled feathers. "And yes, they are, actually. Obsidian. It's a volcanic glass, and it is sharper than any steel blade. However, He glared at her. "It is also quite fragile." "Oh, what's it for?" He sniffed. "I have to cut away the necrotic skin around your wounds. What did you think, child?" Dare had never whimpered in a fight. That's what she wanted to believe, anyway. But she felt herself wincing now. She tried to cover her scarred arms. "I'm rather attached to my skin." "It's dying, child, and so are you." Paina snorted. "Therefore you will let me get rid of it. I will save your life, and I'd prefer if you didn't argue with me about it." She backed behind a cot. "But I don't know what you're doing!" She tiptoed farther away, but he followed. The physician thrust a hand atop her head. He spoke a single word, and she fainted. "No, no! Are we going to have mushroom patties?" the cook exclaimed as she pulled Kelin away from the fire with surprising strength for her slender build. "Sorry." He dropped the spatula. She swiped it from the air. The elf from the trial waved a hand behind her strawberry blonde locks. She eased the mushrooms off the base of the pan with the spatula. Kelin leaned around her shoulder in order to watch her repair the food. He had been smashing the mushrooms onto the skillet, trying to get them to cook quicker. She turned toward him and flashed a smile. "I've fixed it. As much as I can, at least." He blushed and looked down. He ran his tongue over his teeth again. It still amazed him at how it was anything but an elaborate process for them. He had been convinced he'd have to spend the rest of his life speaking slowly and eating only soup. But the physician had given him something to swish around his mouth and then spit out. It had tasted horrible, but instantly he'd felt movement beneath his gums. The elf had handed him a miracle as if he'd passed him a damp rag. His teeth didn't hurt at all now. She shook her head and grinned. "I don't know how you survive if you can't even eat mushrooms." He wheezed a small smile in return. His shoulders dropped and he sighed, but he found that his back wasn't so tight anymore. Maybe it was because he'd escaped with his life twice in as many days, or maybe it was the fact that Dare wasn't around right now. He would kiss the goddess Atome's sandals if she could keep out of trouble. He cleared his throat. "We usually have 'em raw, and not fancy like this." She chuckled. "This isn't fancy. This is camp food. We have to feed everyone, not astound them. It's fancier than anything I've ever eaten." The cook cocked a grin. "I hope not." Up close, her sapphire eyes were multifaceted, the same as a cut gemstone. None of the other elves had eyes like that. And he liked her. He couldn't help it. She had been the only one to look or even smile at him since the trial. He sighed. No longer was he a journeyman blacksmith. He wasn't certain he'd ever wanted a life where adventure tugged at the corner of his soul. Not like Dare, anyway. But here he was. She never thought about things. She just charged ahead. It was always left to him to think and pay attention to the food. The cook hurled several crumpled lettuce leaves at his head. Kelin blinked stupidly. The mushrooms were burning. He dodged her next throw. "Sorry." Then he flinched as he caught movement off to the side. Sir Jacob glanced down at the lettuce bouncing off his armor. "So supper will be late?" Kelin stiffened and reddened. He turned back to the pan and began scraping up the mushrooms. "What are you doing here, Senite?" the cook asked, brushing a thick curl from her face. The knight captain grinned. "Well, my lady, I wanted to see what was for dinner." Kelin angled his head to the side as he listened. They seemed to speak his language like natives. "Right," she replied. "I was not expecting you, especially since you haven't taken the time to have a conversation with me on this horrible journey yet." His grin froze. Now, my lady, I've been a little busy hunting storm readers." He blinked. "That's not something I thought I'd ever say again." "Nor I," the cook whispered. Jacob glanced over at Kelin and grinned. He slapped the human on the back, and as large as Kelin was, he barely absorbed the blow. "And how is this prisoner doing?" Kelin grunted. "I thought prisoners were supposed to be tied up and under guard." The knight uncorked a grin. "Not mine. They work. And if you want to run away, please. I'm sure some animals in the wild lands could use a meal or two." He looked the young man up and down. "Or maybe a whole week's worth. Hey, speaking of working." He beckoned toward the shadows. From around a tree, Fallon inched forward, orange eyes roving back and forth. Jacob beckoned again, sharply this time. Fallon slinked up to them. The knight bent down and set his fingertips on the boy's shoulders. "A dishwasher." "Fallon!" Kelin grinned in relief. "Kelin!" The boy ran at him and tried to tackle his knees. Kelin leaned down and hugged him. "I'm so glad you're safe." "The Red Knight stuck me inside this tent, and it was dark and I couldn't leave." Jacob coughed. "It was for your own good." "Well, you could have left the child a lantern," the cook chided. She snatched the boy's hands. "Now let's get you to work. You too, Kelin." She removed the mushrooms and skillet from the coals. "But," Kelin began. "Now." She tapped a spoon against her hand. Her strict voice was in stark contrast with her sparkling eyes. Kelin ducked his head. "Here." The cook smiled and guided the child to a tub of water. "There's a rag and some soap." The boy lifted a thin wooden plate and dropped it when it folded in half. The cook laughed, and it felt as if they were standing in a rain of rose petals. She picked up the plate and popped it back out. "They're meant to do that, little one. See? They fold in half so they can travel better." Kelin said, "I was under the impression that elves ate on silver and gold." Jacob raised an eyebrow and bit down on a laugh. "Where did you get such an idea? Someone would have to be in an odd situation to be eating on precious metals on the trail." Fallon dropped his eyes and snatched up the wash rag. He scrubbed so hard that soap bubbles flew up past his nose and ears. "Yeah," Kelin replied. His gaze was focused elsewhere. "But it feels like I'm in a different world." The knight captain shrugged. "We're actually not too far from your kingdom." "What? We're not? But there were unicorns and Kelin and—" "Oh yes. Wouldn't risk traveling alone toward it, though." Kelin pressed his arms against his stomach. "How could the Kelin be so close?" "They can be as close as they want if you don't believe they exist." He shivered. "So they could have been in the wildlands all this time, just watching and waiting?" "No," a small voice piped up. Fallon met their gazes. "My dad told me they were all locked away, so we were safe." Kelin bit his lip, remembering what Laurel had said about Darkrain. But how long had the Storm Readers been free? The cook knelt down beside the child. "Yes, they were. They couldn't hurt you. They couldn't hurt anyone." "My dad said they couldn't get out!" He threw a plate down into the bucket of clean water. Jacob sighed. "I suppose they found a way. They were always maliciously inventive." Kelin shook his head. "I thought I knew history well, and I didn't even know the Kemen were real." "I'm not surprised," the knight replied. "Let me guess. You only know about the War of Hell on Earth and the Fall of Palans?" "Yeah," he answered. He'd known there had been other wars, but until Laurel had mentioned it, he'd never heard of the Palans' Front War. "And the only stories we know about the Wildlands are about lots of monsters." Jacob nodded. "That's right. There are monsters out here, just not on the edges." "Like dragons?" Kelin asked. The knight frowned in thought. "Probably. Out by the mountains. We won't encounter anything now that we've got a special protection in this camp. Not even the Storm Readers can find us at the moment." Kelin sighed in relief. "Why are they called the Storm Readers? I thought that's because they could create storms, but apparently that's not true." The cook answered, Because they perceive the subtleties lost to the human eye. They see best in the grey light of dawn and dusk, and of course, before a storm. Fallon's head bobbed up and down.
Mama always said it was a special talent that I could see into the shadows.
He looked up, his eyes as bright as the stars. A tear slipped through, followed by another and another.
I want her back.